Welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today in my series on Palestine, I would like to introduce 3 books on the subject that have shaped my views on Israel-Palestine. And I'm pretty hopeful that if you carefully read these books, you will have a more nuanced and deeper understanding of not just the state of Israel, but also of the Palestinian people, their hopes and aspirations, and the root causes of the tensions between the two communities and the causes of conflict. So the first book that I would love to introduce to you, and which I highly recommend, is Edward Said's The Question of Palestine. Now, Edward Said himself was a Palestinian and was a scholar of comparative literature, spent most of his life and career at Columbia University, most famous for his 1978 book, Orientalism. Now, I do have a series on that book as well on the channel. The Question of Palestine was published in 1979. And at that time, it was the most groundbreaking book on Palestine. And the main reason was that it was written by a scholar who was himself Palestinian, who was deeply trained in Western modes of communication and scholarly writing. But it's also a book which tries, for the first time during that decade, to articulate strongly, historically, and with impeccable research that not only that there are Palestinian people separate from a generalized Arab population, but that they have a national identity and they have national aspirations. Now, when Said was writing this book at that time, the biggest problem the Palestinian struggle faced was that they were conflated with the rest of the Arab population of the Middle East. They were not officially termed Palestinians, even though they claimed to be so. And Israelis would constantly insist on this whole idea that the Palestinians were not a distinct people, but were just part of the general Arab population of the region. Famously, there is an infamous quote associated with Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, who famously said that there were no Palestinian people. So if you want to know how the Palestinians thought of themselves during their struggle, how were they represented by American and Western historians, how their voices were either erased or not mentioned by some of the biggest names in Middle Eastern studies, and how the Israelis thought of them and talked about them in what racialized terms, this is the book for you. And if you ever need to be convinced about whether or not the Palestinians are a people, have a national identity, and deserve a home for themselves, Said's A Question of Palestine is a groundbreaking book, and it will give you not just the history of the Palestinian people, but also a history of their struggles and a history of representation of Palestine. So I highly recommend it. This should be probably the first book you should read on the history of Palestine if you're interested in especially learning the Palestinian point of view. The second book that really helped me inform myself of the history of Israel as well as Palestinian and their national narratives evenly discussed without a bias, in my opinion, is James Galvin's The Israel-Palestine Conflict. Now, this book was published in 2005, but it's now in its 4th edition. So that means if you get the book that is listed in the description, you will get the 4th edition, which is updated. Now, this is a book that tells the story of both sides, but it doesn't privilege one over the other. It basically gives us the story of two competing national visions, Israelis and Palestinians, and within that, the permutations of Israeli politics, right, middle, left, and similarly, the Palestinian idea of self-determination, both from a pacifist point of view, historical point of view, and more radical points of view. But if you need a comprehensive understanding of what major conflicts were there from beginning, from Al-Nakba, right, all the way to the most recent ones, and then if you want to know how Israeli policies impact Palestinian lives, what was the aftermath of Camp David Accords or Oslo Accords, by far, this is probably the most comprehensive book on the subject, and in my opinion, not really biased towards one side or the other. It's one of the very few books also written by a Western historian that gives justified space to the Palestinian story, doesn't elide it, doesn't try to hide it. And Galvin is a historian, and he has taught most of his life, I think, at UCLA. So, second book, a more comprehensive book that tells the stories of both sides with some form of historical integrity, is James Galvin's The Israel-Palestine Conflict, and I highly recommend it. And the third book that I'm going to recommend today, by far to me, this is the most important book, is Jimmy Carter's Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. And there are quite a few reasons for which I like the book. I mean, one reason obviously is that I'm a big Jimmy Carter fan. I've always respected him for his presidency, but also his post-presidency work. But this book is a mixture of personal account of traveling to the Middle East, traveling to Israel and Palestine, infused with experiences of a US former president, his interactions with both sides. But more importantly, this is the book that gives us a history and actually the texts of the UN resolutions on Israel-Palestine, gives us the inside account of the Camp David Accords, gives us Carter's personal impressions of first time visiting Israel, and then his later visits to the Palestinian territories. And the book gives us a blueprint for peace, a reversal to the 1945 plan. It's not really a very complicated book. It's written for general audiences. It's not a scholarly book. It's more of a memoir written by a person who has the inside information on a lot of major events that affected Palestinian and Israeli lives. It's also a book that finally exhorts Israel to be better and to not create a world in which the Arab citizens of State of Israel and the Palestinians living in the occupied territories are treated as second-class citizens or as less than human. It's a deeply Christian book, but Christian in the universal sense of the term, Christian in terms of someone who follows the example of Christ, who has deep respect for the region, but who also believes in justice and equality for the Palestinian people while protecting the Israeli rights to exist. So, a really inspiring book with some deeper insights about the previous peace processes and a blueprint for negotiations and for peace. So overall, these are the three books that helped me shape my opinions about Israel and Palestine. Now remember, I grew up in Pakistan. We grew up obviously idealizing the PLO. But we never really knew the whole story. I remember, I think it was in 1977, when Pakistan held the Islamic Summit. And we as students were standing on the crowds, right? And the biggest cheer went up when Yasser Arafat arrived. So we grew up idealizing the Palestinian resistance. But it was years later when I wanted to inform myself better about the whole history, but also the conflictual history, but also the cultural aspects of it, that I started reading more carefully about Israel-Palestine. And the first major book that I read was Edward Said's The Question of Palestine. Then I actually read carefully and reviewed for a journal James Galvin's book. And then finally, I read Jimmy Carter's book. Now, I've read several other books, of course, as well, because I'm researching for a future book on Palestine. I haven't decided what the title would be. I'll share it here. But I found that these three books were highly important in my learning of Palestine and Israel and the nature of the conflict and the future prospects of any possible peace. So I highly recommend these books. I'll post the links to the books in the description. Please feel free to get them for yourself, gift them to others, and of course, read them carefully. I'm grateful for your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments. This channel, its aim is to share with all of you information about topics, information about events that affect us, and knowledge about literary theory, post-colonialism, and issues of justice and equity. Thank you so much. I'll be back with more on this topic or any other topic. Until then, stay safe, take care of each other, be generous, and from me to you, peace and love.